running up walls and across ceilings, flying through the air in any direction, and manipulating gravity, all within a unique and quirky comic book-inspired light JRPG. If all of these things sound appealing to you, then odds are you are at least aware of the Gravity Rush games. Odds are even better that you've played them and enjoyed them. And you certainly aren't alone. Those who got what Gravity Rush was going for on PlayStation Vita back in 2012 weren't coming up short with compliments for the game's innovative gameplay, interesting main character, and absolutely beguiling world. The game was revealed as an early title for PlayStation's brand new portable console, and was one of the Vita's most well-received early games. And it gave the Vita a nice little bump in popularity with fans of oddball games and JRPGs alike. While it was largely overshadowed by Little Big Planet Vita, Gravity Rush sold very well in Japan at launch, and even held its own in the West reasonably well at first. It wasn't a huge surprise that the game turned out well, I suppose, as the criminally underrated Sony-owned development team, Japan Studio, were the folks behind it. But even still, what they were able to pull off with Gravity Rush on a handheld was nothing short of amazing at the time, despite the limitations of the hardware, relatively small budget, and all the headache involved of starting development on the PS3 and winding up finishing it on the Vita. Yet, here we are, 3 whole years after the launch of the second Gravity Rush game on the PlayStation 4, and not even a whisper of another game in the series. So, what happened? Has Cat soared through the skies of the plains and villages of Gravity Rush for the last time? If so, then what the hell happened to Gravity Rush? Unlike a lot of franchises that end up fading away, Gravity Rush was only given 2 games, 2 chances to make something memorable, and by most accounts, they were able to do that. The first game was certainly a little rough around the edges and perhaps felt a little bland and padded out in the middle, but overall, it was a fun 10-ish hour game that really showed off what the Vita was capable of, and those who liked it really liked it. However, that is sort of a hint at what the early problems of Gravity Rush would be. It would have a very narrow audience. Those who were able to stumble across the game and give it a chance would likely enjoy the game's wacky gravity manipulation, its comic book art style, its jazzy soundtrack, and all the charm that these things would amount to, but the problem was that the amount of people who got their hands on it was a much smaller number than anybody anticipated. And you know, that's not necessarily a huge problem for a game like Gravity Rush. The budget and the team were fairly small, so the amount of sales needed to recoup the cost was fairly minimal. Although that was assuming that the Vita actually took off as a platform and brought enough people to the game to buy it, which, as we all know, didn't quite happen. The Vita definitely ended up being a great platform for indie titles and offbeat Japanese games and other small sorts of projects that weren't too worried about making a bunch of profit, but for first-party games, that was not the case. If you're going to make games for Sony, and you want to hang on to your staff and wealth of resources that ecosystem affords you, you better be bringing in those sales. Gravity Rush did have a strong start in Japan, Europe, and even North America right after its launch, but soon fell off the top 10 charts as games from the 3DS and even some from the PSP overtook it in the mobile gaming market. Whether this was really Japan Studio's fault, creative director Toyoma's, or Sony's for failing to really push the Vita as a platform as much as they should have, is up for debate, but it's hard to ignore that the Vita never really blew up as a platform, and it's hard to sell games for a system that only a few million people in the world even have. Even still, Toyoma-san, Sony, and Japan Studio decided to press on with the franchise by making a sequel, Gravity Rush 2. However, this wouldn't be ready for several years, and Sony was shifting focus from the Vita and the PS3 to their new console, the mighty PlayStation 4. While the dream of making Gravity Rush a long-running franchise for Vita lovers might have been dead, the opportunity to really push the ideas of the game on a much more powerful piece of tech was fast approaching. Gravity Rush 2 would eventually come out, but first, Sony had other plans for the first game. In 2015, right smack dab in the middle of the launch of Gravity Rush on the Vita and Gravity Rush 2 on the PS4, Sony would unleash an expertly remastered version of the original game on the PlayStation 4 worldwide, giving gamers who loved the game on the Vita, and those who completely missed out, a chance to see it running in glorious 1080p and at a buttery 60 frames per second. Sony had given this game special attention by handing it over to the wizards over at Blue Point Games, who have been churning out top-notch remasters of PlayStation games for years. The excellent Metal Gear Solid HD collection and the exquisite Shadow of the Colossus remake from 2018 were all done by these folks, and they gave Gravity Rush that same attention and TLC from top to bottom. On top of it just running better than it did on the Vita, Gravity Rush Remastered would have brand new high-res textures throughout much of the world, including upgraded character models that would more closely match what Japan Studio was working on for the sequel at the time. It would also include all the DLC from the original, which was a nice touch. Unfortunately, it was a bit tougher to get a physical version of the game in North America, as it was only released in a limited form through Amazon, but the digital version was always available, so those who wanted to play it could definitely do so. The remaster sold fairly well for a relatively unknown IP, but ultimately it would serve its main purpose as a bridge for non-Vita gamers to the sequel, Gravity Rush 2. While the development of Gravity Rush 2 did start fairly quickly after Gravity Rush launched, Japan Studios still took their time with the game, giving it a full 5 years of their time before finally releasing it to the world. And what the world got was a far more well-realized version of the world of Gravity Rush. Here, Kat was far more realized as a character. Her moveset was greatly expanded into 3 different styles, and new characters joined her along the way that were far more interesting than the NPCs of the previous game. Plus, the sheer amount of content was far more generous, with lots of side missions, challenge modes, and plenty of secrets to discover if you were up for the exploration. Gameplay variety also got ratcheted up significantly with more enemy variety, mission types, and more diverse locations. This didn't feel like a sequel to a Vita game. Gravity Rush 2 was a real PS4 game, and was treated as one by gamers and reviewers, as it tended to review well with lots of 8s and 9s across the board. However, Gravity Rush 2's first sin was a January release date. Anybody who pays much attention to movie and game releases knows that this is pretty much the worst time of the entire year to release something, and almost guarantees it to take a hit in sales. Also, to the masses, it would be understandable if Gravity Rush 2 seemed somewhat intimidating. It's very different than the standard gaming fare, and I wouldn't blame anyone for thinking, oh, I've obviously got to go play the first one before I can play 2, you don't, and then being turned off by the repetitive fetch quests of the first game, only to never experience the second one at all. Now, there's no real data out there to support this scenario, but I would bet my life that it happened a bunch of times. This, combined with the terrible release date, likely led Gravity Rush 2 to be quickly and thoroughly overshadowed by the other juggernauts of 2017. Despite how great of a game Gravity Rush 2 was, it's pretty tough to compete with Horizon Zero Dawn, Breath of the Wild, Destiny 2, Resident Evil 7, and Cuphead all at once, while also dealing with that intimidating sequel syndrome at the same time. Gravity Rush 2 would quickly drop in price and sell slowly. While those who did get around to it tend to like it, it's just too little too late. Sony shut down Gravity Rush 2's servers in 2019, ending all of the online functionality. Despite the hashtag Don't Forget Gravity Rush going viral for an entire month beforehand. Like most franchises that end up biting the dust, Gravity Rush's problems were visible very early on. The Vita didn't get enough of an install base for the first game to make much of an impact, and a bad release date and the sequel syndrome doomed its sequel to a soft start and an even softer finish. There's no debate that Japan Studio and Kiichiro Toyama's direction were able to pull out quite an experience in Gravity Rush and Gravity Rush 2. The games reviewed well and are almost unanimously loved by those who really gave them a chance. But, unfortunately, that's not the only thing you need in today's world. The power of a game's greatness alone is not enough to make it a success. It has to exist on a viable platform and have a reasonable amount of marketing and support from its publisher. Gravity Rush 1 and 2 just never quite had enough of both of those at once to really make the splash it seemed destined to make. As a result, It's now one of the most underrated franchises in modern gaming history, and may never quite get its due. That's it for this video. If you enjoyed and would like to see more, feel free to hit that subscribe button and hit the notification bell to ensure you'll be notified when new videos go up.